Okay, hello again. Now, before we move on to talking about the rise of Muscovy, I want to spend a few more, I want to spend a few minutes just talking a little bit about um, Kievan Rus, and more specifically, succession. How a society figures out how leadership passes from one person to the next person is a super big deal. I have been struck by time and time again when, if I ask friends in Russian about when America became a democracy, they must all learn this in their schools or something, because they don't think that America was established as a democracy when George Washington became president in the 1780s. They, my Russian friends and acquaintances immediately say, well, America became a democracy when you had a peaceful transition of power from George Washington to John Adams in 1797. That was the crucial moment because it's easy to fight over who's going to be at the top. But in a working society, there's a peaceful transition from power, that the rules of succession are worked out. And they're worked out in a variety of ways. In America, they had worked out, we've this electoral politics that for well over a century, the United States of America had enjoyed a peaceful transition of power, a peaceful succession until the administration of Donald Trump, when we broke that tradition, when he incited a riot to insurrection, resulting in his second impeachment, when a riot attempted to stop the certification of the 2020 election. So that was a really long run for the United States of America in a peaceful transition of power. And so I want to turn our attention to this idea of succession. How do societies work out how to pass power, Representative politics wasn't a twinkle in anyone's eye among the Rurikid princes of Kiev. And so, and it wasn't a twinkle in anyone's eye for a really long time. So what are a variety of ways in which succession was handled? Well, when we think of Western European polities prior to the institution of a participatory politics, rule of law, will go by a variety of names and forms. But in the centuries prior to a kind of a participatory politics in which legitimacy was determined not so much by dynasty, but by the consent of the governed, you had a variety of ways of passing power. And around the year 1000, what emerges as as a norm in Western Europe is primogeniture. And primogeniture is a system where power passes from the father to the oldest son. But primogeniture actually doesn't exist. We don't see that much in Europe, or at all that I'm aware of, before the year 1000. Maybe some of you took Western Civ and have seen this map before. You may remember the reign of Charlemagne. Charlemagne was this Germanic barbarian who, up there in what's now Germany, in his capital of Aachen, attempted to reconstitute, kind of like Timur-Lenk did only centuries before, not the Mongol Empire, but reconstitute a Roman Empire. And he was hugely successful in kind of securing a type of reign and having cultural production and having the most rudimentary form of a bureaucracy that did the king's business. And when he passed away, he didn't leave his realm to one son. He split his realm up between his sons and then his grandsons. And so we had a map of Europe super roughly in the 1840s between Charles and Lothar and Louis. So this moment in 9th century Western Europe is a moment before primogeniture became the norm of doing things. Now, one of the downsides of not having primogeniture, and this, maybe I'm going to kind of be aligning a little bit between concepts of rulership and also concepts of inheritance. to think about it just in terms of inheritance. If you have a really big estate and you have 5 sons, well, you want your sons to be provided for. So you divvy up your estate into 5 bits. And then those sons have 5 sons each. It isn't too long before the family property has been quite diminished. And in forgive me for using a problematic historical term that nonetheless is a term that won't and really shouldn't quite die. In a feudal arrangement where the size of the army retinue you can muster depends upon the amount of land you have, you can quickly see how if you only have a little bit of land, you only have a little bit of military power. And this problem of diminishing assets is one of the things that sparked rulers to begin to have primogeniture. Oh, I wanted to record and I haven't started, have I? Let me just, am I recording? No, let me record. Oh no.
It shows me on your end that you're recording.
Sorry, right, I am recording, good. Okay, thank you. So this was kind of one of the drives between working out a system of primogeniture. And a lot of things follow from it. Some people think it's one of the reasons the Latin church became so corrupt, because you had really rich people looking for something for a second son to do. Some people think it's part of the reason why the Crusades happened. That's a largely debunked theory, but you had these second and third sons who needed something to do. So send them to the Middle East to spill blood there. Some people think that it lent itself to the kind of dynamism and innovation, that you had all these subsequent sons that needed to find a way to make their way in the world. And so they, became explorers or started companies and figured out ways to make their own living because they couldn't count on their inheritance. All of those kind of models that I've just said to you, people will take issue and stab at, but I just kind of want to put this framework for understanding some of the tensions and some of the questions at play in terms of how inheritance passes. So Western Europe mostly decides on primogeniture. In the countries of France, they even decide on primogeniture, and that can't be women. Other countries aren't so strict, don't institute Salic law, kind of that idea that women must not take the throne. We don't have that idea in Eastern Europe or in Ruslands necessarily. Although it tends to be males. It was France that kind of came out hardcore, like no women. So primogeniture takes hold in the West. Primogeniture doesn't quite take hold in the East, and then way farther east, another way of organizing succession that a historian, Almiljan Pritsak, observed, a Turkic way, which he referred to as the home hearth method of succession, was actually a practice where the father's lands were left to the youngest son. And I'm not entirely sure how that all worked, but so that's just kind of to be taken as an example from Pritsak, that there's a variety of ways that succession gets sorted out. So how did Kievan Rus, how did the Kievan Rurikid princes work out succession? Well, there was a system, and historians even debate this. Was it really a system, or was it just chaos? There's a lot of bloodshed and violence in the ways that succession is determined. But what did they have? Well, the historians that are of the school of thought, and I think that to kind of show my hand, I think that these historians do carry the day and demonstrate their case, is that we had a system that goes by a number of names. It's called the collateral, you can call it collateral succession. I've heard it called lateral succession. I've heard the ladder system or the rotor system. And so kind of ladder system, like a step system, people step by step through the ranks, or a rota system, that there's a rotation. And basically this system, and it imperfectly realized in any case, it was the rationale for determining leadership in Kievan Rus. And the way that the great historian, and what this basically meant is, instead of primogeniture, the throne would pass to the next brother. So you're kind of going to go all the way through a generation. Not that the father splits up the territory, because there's a recognition that that isn't good for the long-term interests of the family or the dynasty, but that it doesn't just go son to son, it goes kind of through the brothers. And then when the last brother dies, then it would go, well, where would it go? Would it go to the oldest born son of the last son, or would it go back up the line to a nephew? Or if that person's already passed, because if there's a lot of brothers, you would presume that many years had gone by, people had died, and so would it go to a cousin, right? So it's a pretty complicated system, and it becomes even more complicated because it wasn't, it was linked to territory. And so here we have this map of maybe Kiev and Rus, and you had all these principalities. Actually, here's a better map. And so you had Kiev down here, Kiev, and then you have Galicia and Volhynia, which are now very much are parts of Ukraine, and kind of the parts of Ukraine that are really not interested in being part of Russia and haven't been such a and history helps us understand why they're not interested in being part of Russia, because for so much of their history they weren't part of Russia. Even during the Mongol conquest, the princes of Galicia and Volhynia kind of made separate deals with the Mongol Khans about serving up troops and whatnot. So they really kind of have a history that's quite separate, even though they were one of the principalities in this Kiev and Rus place. And so you had Galicia and Volhynia, Kiev, Pereyaslav, Novgorod-Seversk, Chernigov, Murom, Vladimir Suzdal, Smolensk, Polotsk, Novgorod. There's also Murom Ryazan, Turov. And now Kiev is early on the kind of golden city, the richest, most important place. And this is the place where the Grand Prince sits. Interesting, kind of an interesting concept here to put on your radar screen. Until Ivan III or Ivan IV, when Muscovite princes start calling themselves Tsar, they were called Grand Prince. And in some ways it was just kind of one prince among other princes, as opposed to like a king that is really elevated among the others. So you might almost think of it as this kind of first among equals, rather than someone that is so far out in front. Interestingly, Yulia Mikhailova, who now teaches at New Mexico Tech, but did her dissertation and finished in 2013 at UNM, her dissertation kind of looks at Western European, Central European chronicles about this concept of kingship. And one of the things that she finds in her dissertation is that even the term king isn't used, rex from the Latin, isn't used so often. And kind of the implication of what she thinks she saw is perhaps that maybe even that distance between king and retinue in a Western European sense is we don't want to exaggerate it or push it so far back in time to the 11th or in 12th centuries, the sort of elevated absolutist claims that we see in the 16th century, like the claims of King Henry VIII is sort of the epigee, and then, well, when Louis the Last tries it, it doesn't go so well, right? But kind of, I think of King Henry VIII as this like king making as an absolute ruler. What's the law? The law is what I say the law is. Kind of, there's a sense that maybe in the earlier terms, no one's getting away with this. It's not like a Persian sultan who is, royalty, even as we have divine right theory emerging, etc. But so anyway, so there's this idea that you have a grand prince and he sits in Kiev, and Kiev is the best city. And so when he passes away, the cities are ranked, and I don't remember exactly how they're ranked, but you might have the prince from Pereyaslav, he moves into Kiev and starts being Grand Prince. And then his brother is going to move from Ryazan and take up residence in Pereyaslav, and everyone rotates. And so that's where you get this idea, the rota system. And the principalities themselves are ranked, so kind of in a ladder, step system. And so that's this idea of very roughly how it works. Of course, you can so quickly see it's really problematic, because if you have a son who wants rulership or someone's passed away, between cousins, etc. And so we see quite a bit of violence from the time that Vladimir the Great dies. Um, it seems like more often than not, there is a contest for rulership. And that led some historians to say, you're just making it up. There's no system at all. There's no system at all here. It's just chaos where might makes right. And um, the Ottoman system in the 16th century, to offer a comparative comment here, was sort of that the Sultan would have many different sons, and often, because there was a harem, from different mothers, and those mothers would sort of be grooming their sons, because there would come a point at time where the Sultan passes, and then those sons are just going to fight it out, and whoever emerges on top is going to be the Sultan. All right. So there was a system, and violence was kind of part of the recipe. And then there's this question of, so how did the rota system in Kiev work? Well, I'm not going to bore you, or not bore you. It is fascinating, but it's also quite intricate. I'm not going to really delve into any of these details, except to say that from the time that Vladimir dies in 1015 to the 1300s, we see many violent transitions. Boris and Gleb have gone down as saints in the Orthodox tradition, and they were princes who were murdered by their brother Svyatopolk, who took the throne instead of having those brothers take the throne. Quite interestingly, Boris and Gleb, they refused to raise a hand against their brother. They wouldn't raise the sword, and they died martyrs. Is what the historical record tells us. Otherwise, Saint Vladimir, who might not have given up his harem when he embraced Christianity, we don't know about that. But the historical record really suggests that Boris and Gleb did refuse to fight, and were murdered by brothers more aggressive and committed to taking the throne. So those are just a few words. This idea, was there a system or wasn't there, it obtains into the way succession passes by Muscovite princes, except we'll have these moments where a particular territory will opt out, if you will. So, and I'll just put one historical example on your radar screen. Here, the second bullet point. In 1097, the Rurikid princes of all those principalities, they get together at a place called Lübeck, and they make an agreement about how succession is going to pass through. And one of the things that they did at that agreement is that certain territories were going to go to families that existed right then and there. And that helped simplify things in a way, because it meant a family, like, I'm in charge of this, my descendants are going to get Chernigov for here and ever after. It means the Prince of Chernigov is never going to be vying to be the Prince of Kiev. And this sort of is one of the way that the Rurikid line sort of closed itself off from making claims on the Kievan throne. And so it was sort of this conference 1097 that says, hey, we got to have a solution. And at that point, Chernigov says, we'll never claim Kiev again. Not everyone did that. It's complicated. But I want you to be, I just wanted to say a few, although I know I haven't totally cleared up this confusing system, but say a few words about how the question of succession gets worked out in Kievan Rus. And with that, I will stop recording here.